Good morning, everyone. Welcome to all of you this morning. Welcome back after our summer hiatus, and a special welcome to a few of my family members who are Zooming in for this service. I hope that especially my parents find this message interesting and not too embarrassing, given the topic. I'm putting them on the spot a little bit. I begin this message with a question. Do we grow up to become our parents? You won't be surprised to learn that I don't intend for you to have a simple yes or no answer by the end, but I do hope to give you a range of things to think about when you ponder that question. When you hear that question, you might think about things like whether you have that same quirky way of slurping your coffee that a parent does, or whether you have the same laugh, the same gait, the same love of chocolate, or the same temperament. Having just come back earlier this month from an extended visit with my parents, I know that those kinds of things are often fascinating and amusing and are important in the stories we tell about ourselves. But I'm a sociologist, so my professional expertise is looking at the big picture patterns in our social relationships rather than at the individual experiences per se. Sociologists think about how all of those little things add up, how individual experiences connect to society, to culture, and especially to inequality. So for instance, we might ask how having tastes, interests, or talents that resemble those of our parents affects the kinds of jobs that we choose, and ultimately the patterns of inequality that result. But even though I want to point out some of these big patterns today, most of us wrap our heads around these things much better if we begin with an example. So that's what I'm going to start with. And I'm going to incorporate a few photos here since our Zoom service gives me the ability to easily do that. So give me just 1 second. One of my earliest memories in life is the one in this picture. This was 1978, so I'm going to date myself here, and I'm the 2-year-old in the middle of the photo. On the left is my mom receiving her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kansas. I honestly don't remember a lot about this, even though I do remember it. I remember a giant auditorium where the ceremony was held, and I remember being way up high with my dad, far away from where my mom walked across the stage. I guess that as a 2-year-old, I probably didn't understand what exactly was going on or why it might be important. And I almost certainly had no idea at that point in time, or honestly for quite a few years after that, that there was anything particularly exceptional about my parents' education or what they did for a living. By the time I was 10 or so, they were both, guess what, college professors. It was just what I knew. It was normal for me. My father's path was a little different than my mom's, but in the end, really very similar. He too became a professor, and after getting hired for that job, he went back to earn his PhD, which he did by the time I was a young adult. And here he is. This is 1998. In my parents' generation, higher degrees like this are still a bit more common among men than among women. My dad is one of the 2.5% of men in that generation who have a doctoral degree. And my mom is one of around 1% of all women in that generation who have a doctoral degree. But no matter how you cut it, the only accurate statement about my parents' situation in terms of my experience is that I grew up in a family with tremendous educational privilege. What was just normal for me was in fact not very typical at all. Like many young people, I had some years in which very high up on my list of goals was to distance myself from my parents. For a while, I was going to be a violinist. Some of you heard me play the violin now and again. But even though neither of my parents was a professional musician, neither was this a hobby I pulled out of nowhere. My mom had studied piano and organ for many years and music therapy in college, and I had grown up hearing her sing and play. My freshman year in college, I thought I was really following my own path when I purposely chose for my schedule Introduction to Sociology instead of Introduction to Psychology, since my mom was a psychologist. And one final example, also from my young adult years, I thought I would stray from my dad's advice by refusing to formally study mathematics in college. My dad thought that would be a good choice for me, in part because his excellent lessons in math from before I even knew how to talk had made me reasonably good at it. But despite my refusal to officially study math, I would end up taking an interest in statistics and quantitative sociology. So I didn't leave that parental influence too far behind in the dust either. As you can see, my distinctions from my parents were pretty tiny in the grand scheme of my professional life, laughable almost. Here are some paths I didn't consider. I never considered not going to college. In fact, I never really even considered not going to graduate school. And this is my final picture. This is me receiving my PhD in 2007. In a somewhat ironic twist, given what I've just told you, as I got more and more interested in sociology, I was especially interested in questions of social mobility, or the study of whether people stray from the life paths of their parents. Maybe you can now see why that topic was of special interest to me. Now, all of this is fine and good for me. I have a job that I love, and parents who over the years have understood most of the ins and outs of the professional hoops I've jumped through. I'm deeply grateful for all of that. And this is also not to say that there weren't bumps in the road for me and times when I surely felt like my professional destination was unclear and uncertain. And there were ways that outside of my professional life, I did things that were less predictable in terms of what my parents modeled. But it's important not to overlook the fact that my personal experiences were part of a larger pattern, a pattern that helps us to understand social inequality. It's not the case that being a college professor just so happens to be a good fit for me, while other jobs are a good fit for others, or that there was some random shake of the dice and this happens to be the job that I ended up in. And it's not without larger consequences that my family background made me more likely than many other people to fall into this line of work. Here's why this pattern is so important. College professor is a job attached to tremendous privilege. For every job as a college professor with good pay, good benefits, high job security, and a very high level of autonomy to organize my own time and express my own opinions, there are dozens of other jobs with less pay, less job security, fewer benefits, and far less autonomy. And it is certainly not a coincidence or an accident that my parents happen to have had this same type of job. The larger pattern here is that privileged parents, in both intentional and unintentional ways, pass along their privilege. I can assure you, and my parents probably can too, that they weren't consciously thinking about how to turn themselves or into themselves, or consciously strategizing about how to bequeath their educational privileges to me. In fact, the overt lessons they taught me were often quite the opposite of that I should find my own individual path, that I should do something I'm passionate about, and that I should care about justice, equity, and compassion, our second principle. I'll point out here that my parents are Lutherans and not UUs, but thankfully UUs don't have a monopoly on some of the ideas interwoven into our principles. As I noted in today's, as was noted in today's Thought for Contemplation, the less intentional lessons from our parents are sometimes more consequential than the intentional ones. Quote, "Children learn more from what you are than what you teach," wrote W.E.B. Du Bois, a foundational American sociologist and theorist of race and inequality in the early 20th century. So for a UU like me, committed to our second principle, how am I to think about the contradictions inherent in all of this? In American society, one of the most commonly heralded solutions to a disadvantaged background is upward mobility. This is the idea that even if you start off in a family with relatively few resources in terms of education or income or wealth, you should and can reach for the stars, strive to go to college, strive to become a high-paying professional, strive to purchase a nice house in a good neighborhood or community so that your children can go to good schools. This is the essence of the American dream. It turns out that this ideology has been deeply internalized by most parents and children, and young people from all different kinds of backgrounds actually have pretty similar aspirations in terms of these kinds of things. For better, and maybe in some cases for worse, most people want these kinds of things for themselves or for their children. Aspirations are not a particularly important barrier to inequality, to equality. But while aspirations might be uniformly high, we obviously have an unequal and highly differentiated economy, and not everyone lands at the top. In contemporary American society, we tend to believe that limited opportunities should ideally be allocated according to merit, which we understand to mean some combination of ability and effort. And in fact, we have a term for a social system structured around merit. We call it meritocracy. Today's reading from a few minutes ago highlights some of the cracks in the ideology of meritocracy, but I thought it might be interesting to give you the backstory on the history of that word meritocracy. In 1958, a British sociologist named Michael Young wrote a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy. If you think the word meritocracy has been around forever, you might be surprised to learn that Michael Young actually invented that word for this book in 1958. The book was a satire, and the word meritocracy was a spoof on the word aristocracy, an hereditary system which obviously had very deep roots in British society. Young's argument in his book was that ultimately meritocracy would look a lot like aristocracy, except that inherited privileges of the upper classes would now be justified on the basis of quote unquote merit. Parents would cultivate in their children the traits that would allow those children to succeed in schools and in the modern economy, traits like certain kinds of academic abilities and certain kinds of effort. The major difference between the old aristocracy and the new meritocracy, according to Young, would be that in the new meritocratic system, people who failed to rise to the top would blame themselves rather than the system, which would ultimately serve to make the system more legitimate and more stable than the old aristocracy was. So perhaps needless to say, Michael Young wasn't a fan of even the idea of meritocracy. Young's cautionary tale about the impossibility of developing a society designed around rewards for merit is mostly lost on modern audiences, I think. But most of us do easily recognize ways that the society we have is not meritocratic, which is in line with today's reading. Rich parents can afford things for their kids that poor parents simply can't. Some parents can afford intellectually stimulating toys, enriching summer camps and private schools, or more commonly houses and communities with good public schools, while other parents can't afford those things. And then there are the less monetary advantages, the kinds of things that were certainly extremely important in my own life and that Luke and I pass on to our children, whether we consciously try to or not. Kids with more highly educated parents hear literally millions more words spoken at home than poor kids, developing their language abilities in ways that are rewarded at school. Highly educated parents regularly use formal math and science concepts to help children reason through practical choices from a very young age, again, in ways that are rewarded at school. The problem is that we can't actually separate out, quote unquote, merit from the kinds of unmeritocratic advantages that parents pass along to their children. Parents use their resources to cultivate merit in their children. At the end of the day, one of the major barriers to any societal shift toward equal opportunity for all children is that for advantaged families, equal opportunity generally means greater downward mobility, something that we talk a lot less about than upward mobility. You might say, no, everyone can succeed. There doesn't need to be downward mobility. But that's just not true, given the highly differentiated economy we have. If everyone makes it through high school or to college or through college, that just means that the bottleneck for competition over scarce resources happens later. I sometimes ask my students who say they espouse the value of equal opportunity if they or their parents would have wanted for there to be more competition for them to get admitted to college, since that's what equal opportunity would mean. Equal opportunity means trying to help disadvantaged kids better compete with advantaged kids, but by itself, this doesn't create more opportunities. We can certainly try to reduce the number of ways that parents can use their financial and other resources to gain advantages for their own children, but this is an uphill battle for sure. Parents use the resources they have at their disposal to advance their children's interests. This happens in ways that we find to be explicitly unfair or even unlawful. Think about the college admission scandal from a couple of years back. But much, much more important than that are all the ways of passing along privilege that we consider to be perfectly legitimate and indeed desirable. We find this process in the United States today, but we also find it in every other society in which people have studied these things. We see it in capitalist countries, we see it in communist and state socialist countries, we see it in different historical periods. Scholars in my field have in fact documented only very minor differences in the extent to which different societies have managed to weaken that link between parents and children's social positions. This is not to say that there isn't some mobility. Many of you, unlike me, have very different jobs and very different economic positions than your parents did. Critics of the idea of meritocracy, like Michael Young that I mentioned earlier, would say that it's actually important for modern societies to have enough mobility to legitimize the way things work, to prove that if you don't make it to the top, it must be your own personal fault. So where does that leave us in terms of imagining a society of greater justice and equity aligned with our second principle? An alternative to focusing only on mobility and opportunity is to center a strategy of justice and equity, our second principle, on our first principle, the worth and dignity of every person, and to take the idea of worth quite literally. That principle, the first one, doesn't state that a person should have an equal opportunity for worth and dignity someday. It emphasizes the inherent worth and dignity of every person right now. One of the biggest barriers to equity and justice in the contemporary United States, and many other places too, is the way that we've allowed market principles to override any commitment we might have to worth and dignity. We tolerate considerably higher levels of poverty and income inequality than we need to. And we know that this is true because we have very good examples of other societies that choose paths of considerably less inequality. In fact, the United States is more unequal and has more poverty than any other wealthy democracy. The most straightforward way to change inequality is to directly target it with policy, not to focus single-mindedly on trying to get everyone into the most prestigious kinds of jobs someday when they grow up, which is numerically impossible anyway, but to ensure that even in the least prestigious positions, a person can still lead a life of worth and dignity. There is simply no good reason why a person should be required to enter a limited set of high status, mostly professional jobs in order to have a decent standard of living, though that is increasingly true in the contemporary United States. If we loop back to the question of social mobility, you'll recall that I said before that mobility doesn't vary much across societies. That's true, but the existing evidence we have about how societies can increase social mobility across generations, at least a little bit, suggests that the best way to do that is to equalize the resources that parents have at their disposal to invest in their children. It's actually easier to equalize those resources than to try to tell parents they can't use the resources they have to benefit their children. In short, we achieve somewhat greater social mobility across generations by promoting greater economic equality right now. But I would argue that even more critically, if we promote greater equality right now, we also lower the stakes for mobility. We make it less important whether someone moves up, down, or sideways compared to their parents. Researchers have actually shown that these very high stakes for mobility in some contemporary societies like the United States are part of the explanation for why we see such skyrocketing rates of mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. And that's true regardless of where in the social hierarchy you might find yourself. It turns out that greater income and wealth inequality make all of us more anxious about status and how others see us, regardless of whether we ourselves are upwardly mobile, downwardly mobile, or something in between. So back to my question about whether we grew up to become our parents. Some of us definitely do, at least in certain ways. On the other hand, others of us traverse great distances, both geographically and psychologically, to escape the disadvantages of our childhoods. Each of us grapples with both the uniqueness of our own life journey and the ways that our journey fits into a larger whole. For our UU faith and our commitment to equity and justice, the challenge is to build a society and a world in which every journey is valued and every destination has moral and economic worth. Blessed be, and amen.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you, Harry, for that beautiful special music as well. Our closing hymn is number 301, Touch the Earth, Reach the Sky.